this is Peak Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another video review, and this will be my spoiler review for Dune Part 2. Now this won't be a chronological breakdown, but much more of a focus on the standout elements which I felt worked well and didn't work quite as well overall within the movie. And as my non-spoiler review was somewhat of a negative constructive analysis, I will start more on the positives this time round. And we'll start off with the movie's first third, which I thought was the best phase of the film. And I thought it was a very good start as we see Paul and the Fremen ambushing the Harkonnen forces in a very stealth assassin-like fashion. We had all of those moments when, as Paul was walking along the desert, we see all of the dead bodies of the soldiers dropping down from the sky like flies, as the Fremen were also using laser rifles, I believe, to take them out. And this was probably the one real time throughout the film where they generated a real thrill and suspense, and this was far more engaging than the very mundane beginning of the first film. And my hopes for this movie had increased during this stage of the film. The movie also did well to start on Paul's progression as the leader of the Fremen, or the Ma'Dib as they pronounce it, and I very much like that the film took a lot of time to show the overall progression of him trying to earn their respect and their adulation. We started off the story with the Fremen doubting his role, which made sense, especially after he killed Jamis in part 1, which I still think was an unnecessary death, but again that was part of the source material. And it was good that Paul didn't start off already as this established leader. Again, it added credibility to his character that he went on this journey, struggling at first to get to grips with his overall responsibility and role, various times questioning himself and his ability, and then learning to become more confident as the story progressed. And overall, I think that's somewhat of a good development of the character. And continuing on this phase, overall the best performance of the film was Javier Bardem as Stilgar, giving much more screen time this time round. He did bring that charisma and likability, and he was easily the most appealing character of the movie. Yes, he did walk that fine line between engaging character and comic relief. If not as foolish, then perhaps a bit too eager in believing Paul. Maybe he was coming across as a bit gullible at times, and this was pointed out by Chani through various points of the film. But overall, I did think it was the best performance. And I also liked the dynamic at the start between Paul and Chani. Again, it was very good that she doesn't just fall in love with him straight away. And I thought there was actually some good chemistry here, where many other reviewers didn't feel this, but I did like the fact that they again took time to build on the relationship between the two characters. I did like in particular the scene where both of them were sitting in the desert, and the music that played during this moment, I believe the title track is called A Time of Quiet Between the Storms. I thought it was a very good moment here, and again just furthered the overall dynamic between both personalities. And yes, we did get some standout visual sequences, whether it was Paul riding the sandworm for the first time, that was very well done. And for me, it was probably the only time where the appearance of a sandworm really created that true sense of awe and wonder. I still feel that the sandworms themselves weren't that creative in terms of their overall design. They didn't really generate that true grit and viscerality whenever they appeared. It was almost like they moved too smoothly, too cleanly, as we saw all of their sequences, especially towards the climatic battle at the end. Now, after all of that positive view, I will now focus on the more negative aspects, and on this first section, I will call this part the weak-ass villains. Now, normally with this type of film, the bigger, more expansive sequel, where we up the ante and we raise the stakes, we also normally raise the level of the villains. For example, we look at Terminator 2, The Dark Knight, or indeed Empire Strikes Back. And on paper, Dune Part 2 had a whole collective of villains who could have easily imposed themselves on the story, but unfortunately, they're all terrible. Whether it's Austin Butler's Freya Rafer Harkonnen, who I just thought was very weird with his bald head and black tongue and crackled vocals, the film pushed so hard to try and make him this terrifying psychopath, but I just saw it as very over-the-top, edgelord wannabe one note, and it just wasn't that impressive. And his role came at the expense of Dave Bautista's Ghost of Rabin, who I felt did carry some menace in part 1, but they really cut him down this time round. For the most part here we see him throwing temper tantrums, as he continuously proves himself incompetent time and time again. We see him and his army constantly outsmarted and ambushed easily by the Fremen, and that really took away a lot of his credibility. And it also reduced a lot of the threat level of the Harkonnen, as we see Rabin constantly running away from the Fremen. We had that very unintentionally funny scene where we see him absolutely petrified as one of the Fremen jump onto the departing ship, and he almost kills him, and he looks very hapless and gormless for the most part. And this is proven once more as we see him easily defeated by Gurney in the final battle. We then talk of Stellan Skarsgård's Baron Harkonnen, who like Rabin got more scenes this time round, but like part 1, he doesn't nearly do anything substantial. He doesn't have any big moments or big lines. He's just there again because of the source material, but narratively, you could have taken him out of the story or reserved him for part 3. Again, when we see Paul killing him at the end, it's so easy, it's so quick that you don't really feel anything from the moment. And as mentioned in my non-spoiler review, the biggest disappointment was Christopher Walken's Emperor. I had such high hopes that Christopher Walken was going to produce this all-commanding presence, chewing up all of the scenery, but he's probably in the film for a total of around 5 minutes. And when he's on screen, he just appears as very frail and on the script carrying no presence whatsoever. And his status as the Emperor is constantly undercut as we see him really dictated to by Princess Aurelin and other members of the Bene Gesserit. Unlike the other villains, the Emperor just seemed tactically out of his depth, despite having a superior number and forces. Now I know it's a source material, but it really seemed unnecessary for the Emperor to actually expose himself by travelling to Arrakis. A character like this normally stays secure in his own empire, behind the scenes, delegating others to do his bidding, and only really emerging when it's absolutely necessary. Yes, the movie establishes that he's concerned because of the intentions of the Baron, but I still don't think it was enough to completely travel all the way to Arrakis, putting himself under threat. And as mentioned, all of these antagonists are completely outmaneuvered for the most part, and for all of the spectacle and visuals in the climatic battle, the Fremen kind of win these fights too easily. And at this point, the film was really trying to rush through the story in terms of its dynamics, where we get Paul negotiating the terms of the Emperor, and this whole sequence, I was just thinking, why doesn't Paul just take the throne anyway, as the Fremen were clearly on top. And again, I know this is part of the source material, but for me, it just didn't seem that important. And when I look at overall the amount of people that were included in terms of the villains, I think 4 overall was too many. And you could have easily shifted both the Baron and Emperor to part 3. This would have given much more time for the other antagonists to really make a much more imposing presence on the story. And when we talk of lacking importance, we have to mention what should have been a massive turning point, where after having various dreams and visions and after drinking the water of life, Paul discovers that he's actually the grandson of Baron Harkonnen, through him being the father of Lady Jessica. Now this should have been a huge reveal and moment, both in terms of emotion and character. As throughout the film, Paul has made several references to maintaining his father's name and his honour, so him discovering that his true heritage as being the grandson of one of the galaxy's most frightening villains should have been the catalyst for a much darker, intense turn in his persona, which could have really upped the ante. But the film just speeds through this moment, almost like a blink and you miss it moment, and again, it's part of the source material, I understand, but in terms of this story, it was really rendered unimportant, and I honestly think it should have just left out completely, as it didn't matter. This revelation really should have been linked to the much overblown scene that we get when we see Paul going on full, almost dictator, shouting out at the Fremen, condescending over them, and I know they were going for this much more thrilling moment where Paul was really now imposing all of his power and influence, but again, I just think it was overdone. And it really seemed a bit sudden. You didn't really feel that it was truly justified, him making this overall transformation in his character. And it was just one of many examples of the movie not really developing the many ideas that it was putting together throughout its narrative. Another element that I wasn't convinced by was the whole water of life, which again is part of the source material, but in terms of the movie, I just didn't get the real importance of the water of life. We have all of these dream sequences where we see Paul and Jessica coming under the influence when they drink it. We see Jessica somehow communicating to a stillborn baby who they named Alia. And again, this is part of the books, but in terms of the movie and how it played out, it just came across as really weird. Now, I do understand that this was part of the filmmakers trying to compensate for the fact that in the book, the character of Alia is already a young child, and she's the one who ends up killing the Baron. And story-wise, I think the filmmakers realised that including Alia just would have been one character too many, so I do agree with what they did here. And of course, we did get the quick cameo of Anya Taylor-Joy as an adult Alia, hinting at a future appearance within any potential part 3. And as well as not really understanding the water of life, I also felt that we didn't quite delve as much into the mystical powers of the spice, which is really the whole driving narrative around this entire mythology. At least part 1 did focus to a certain extent on seeing how the spice affected others. Again, through all of the visions that Paul was experiencing, they really didn't concentrate on the spice and how important it was in terms of much more how it affects humans this time around. We then talk about what's been the biggest problem for many people throughout this film, and that is the characterization of Chani. Now, as mentioned before, I initially liked the character in the first half of the film, where we see while she's initially skeptical of Paul, which did make sense, she's also willing at least to give him a chance to prove himself. and I felt she was very likeable enough with a strong resolve. But as Paul's ascension continued, she becomes far more angry and complacent. We have multiple scenes either with Lady Jessica or Stilgar or Gurney where she's walking off, stomping her feet, having temper tantrums. She's angry for not being listened to, for not getting enough attention. Even the scene where she revives Paul with the water of life, again, a moment which I didn't fully understand. She seemed to take a drop of the water of life and then mix it in with her teardrop, which somehow revived Paul. It just didn't make any sense. And then when Paul comes back alive or out of consciousness, she just stomps off once again in a tantrum. And throughout these phases, she became far less and less likeable, really doing, I think, a disservice to actress Zendaya, who has always had this likeable charisma on screen. And again, it undercut the character's credibility as she simply fails to understand Paul's importance and how his role is strengthening the Fremen's determination within the battle. She just seems unhappy that she's not getting her due in terms of her attention. And this was compounded after the climatic fight between Paul and Fried, which was well staged, if not again a bit won too easily by Paul. But we have the development at the end where Paul chooses to marry Princess Irulan in order to claim the throne. Again, anybody could understand why he had to do this, clearly knowing that Paul has no affection for the princess whatsoever and it's much more of a marriage of convenience. But no, Chani doesn't see that. Even after Paul tells her that she's the only one that he loves, that's still not good enough for her, and once more she stomps off again in an angry tantrum. And this moment hints at very much a separation between her and Paul, so having known the outline of the future books, I'm really not sure how Villeneuve is going to take on this development going into part 3. And concentrating on Chani again when we talk of the movie's final scene, which seems to be the most contentious part for many people who watch this film, where we see Paul consolidating his position and we see the Fremen boarding all of the ships, getting ready to take on the other factions who opposes Paul's role in what is very much the beginning of the Holy War. This really should have been the final euphoric scene of the film, seeing a Paul triumphant, leading all the forces out to save the world. But for some strange reason, Villeneuve decided to end the movie, seeing Chani all angry and bitter as she walks out to the desert, getting ready to ride a sandworm, and then the movie just ends there. And all of a sudden you're just thinking, is that it? Are we going to see some sort of end credits after? But no, the movie just stops. And it's such an abrupt ending, again, even worse than the first film, which wasn't that abrupt because at least we could say, well, Paul was walking off into the distance looking to join the Fremen. But for all of the hype and all of the spectacle and all of the bigger story that this movie was trying to tell, to end it on such a flat note really does a bit of a disservice. Even for people that like this film, agrees that this was not the right way to conclude the overall story. It doesn't really leave it on a cliffhanger, and it definitely doesn't bring an overall resolution to the overall story either. So I'm not really sure what Villeneuve is implying here. Is he going to develop a major change for part 3? Will we see Paul become completely corrupted by his power? And will Chani end up being a saviour? We assume that Florence Pugh will be far more involved as the princess in part 3. Now I do know as the story develops that it does involve the princess trying to get Chani pregnant, and she does eventually die from childbirth, and both of the children will then go on to have more prominent roles in future installments. But having seen the outline of Dune Messiah, which is the second book that Villeneuve will be looking to adapt in part 3, I just can't see how he's going to do it. If we think about it, he's taken nearly 6 hours to tell the first book, which for the most part was a pretty streamlined narrative. Yes, many fans have outlined that so many elements have been taken up, but if you look at the core part of the story, it is very much straightforward. But when we look at Dune Messiah, there are so many other very outlandish plots and storylines. When we look at certain characters, it involves some people getting brought back to life. I'm just not sure how Villeneuve is going to take on that material. And if we're saying that both parts 1 and 2, which easily could be merged into one film at nearly 2 hours and 40 minutes, then surely it indicates that Dune Messiah, or part 3, whatever he decides to call it, is going to run at least 3 hours long. And that is a prospect I'm truly dreading, as overall when I look at this film, I still think it was very overhyped. Yes, it had the spectacle, and yes, it had the serious intent, and it certainly had far more bigger imposing moments than part 1. But overall, I just felt it was lacking in terms of characterization and also the emotional weight and core, and it really left me again disengaged and disinvested in the story. I really hate all the comparisons with Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, but I'll probably talk about that in a separate video. But I just think Dune Part 2 overall whilst certainly having some good moments, was very much of a letdown and an overall disappointment. So that's my overall spoiler review of Dune Part 2. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you have any other topics or movies or suggestions that you'd like to see me cover within this channel, then also let me know within the comments, and I will see if I can provide further commentary for you within the future. Please hit like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.